Tattoos are ubiquitous with maritime culture, being a tradition among seamen since at least the 1800s. By proxy, they have become associated with Golden Age pirates. In the 1995 film Cutthroat Island, a tattoo serves as a major plot point, when the father of Morgan Adams has a treasure map tattooed into the back of his head. When Daddy perishes, Morgan has to scalp the corpse of her own father in order to retrieve the map. Speaking of cranial tattoos, one also appears in the TV series Black Sails, on the back of the quartermaster's head, in the form of the all-seeing Eye of Providence. Although associated with the Illuminati these days, it seems to represent the Eye of God watching over humanity, much how the quartermaster watches over his crew. The Illuminati was not established until the late 18th century. However, the Freemasons existed in the Age of Pirates. They did use the Eye of Providence as a symbol, and there might actually be a strange connection between this symbol, the Freemasons, and pirates. In the wreck of Sam Bellamy's Widdy Galley, archaeologists were able to find a pewter plate with a familiar symbol cut into it, the Freemason compass and square, which often had the Eye of Providence in it. During this period, there was a schism between different Freemason sects over the recent deposing of the Stuart dynasty, which many of the Golden Age pirates supported, sympathizing with a political movement called Jacobitism. We do know that pirates like Charles Vane had actual contacts with the Jacobites and even the court of the deposed Stuarts. Perhaps this pewter plate indicates further connections between the Jacobites, Freemasons, and pirates. The quartermaster also has the words "Hold Fast" tattooed across his knuckles, both a reference to the actor's biography and the film Master and Commander. It seems to be a maritime tradition, the words meant to invoke a stronger grip while working the rigging, but I do not know how old it is. And of course, one cannot forget to mention Jack Sparrow, the second worst pirate I've ever heard of after John Rackham, who has a number of tattoos, not to mention criminal brands, burned into his skin, the letter P for piracy in his forearm. This begs the question, of course, if real pirates ever had tattoos. The question doesn't have a simple yes or no answer. For one, the word tattoo was never commonly used before the 1770s, with the publishing of travel accounts by Antoine de Bougainville and James Cook, both of whom visited Polynesia and witnessed the tattooing of the locals. It either derives from the Polynesian ta, meaning to strike something, or the Tahitian tatau, meaning to mark something. However, it is wrong to assume that Captain Cook introduced the idea of skin markings to Europe. One of the issues is that there wasn't a unified English word before the introduction of tattoo. Tattooing was invariably known as pricking, marking, engraving, decorating, puncturing, staining, or even embroidering. And tattoos were called things such as marks, pricks, spots, or figures. Indeed, the practice was actually widespread in early modern Europe, even before. Tattooing, as it turns out, is quite ancient. The oldest one found in Europe might date back to the Iceman, Ötzi, whose mummified body in the Alpine mountains carried 61 tattooed marks. Tattooing was used by the Greeks and Romans to mark slaves, soldiers, and other subordinates. Before that, they appear on mummies and frescoes from ancient Egypt. Tattoos were an important part of ancient Middle Eastern culture. Judaism took a stance against it, banning tattooing as a pagan practice, and an affront to God. Christianity, however, took a more pragmatic approach, permitting tattoos anywhere that wasn't the face. They became an excellent way to show one's piety. The European tattooing tradition really picked up pace with the Crusades. Pilgrims and crusaders would wear a visible cross in some manner to show off their intentions. Some would even cut or brand their own skin, often claiming it was a miraculous imprint from the Lord. In the 15th century, the most common symbol of pilgrims was the Jerusalem cross, a cross with 4 additional crosses in each of its cantons. These cantons were supposed to represent the wounds or stigmatas of the Lord. Tattoos and other skin markings were often associated with stigmatas in the early modern age. By the 16th century, it had become common practice for pilgrims to tattoo religious symbols into their skins. This was usually done by local Arabs or Armenians, drawing from their ancient tattooing practices, which were still commonplace. Thus began a tradition of pilgrimage tattoos that would persist into the modern day. The world's oldest tattoo shop is still up and running in Jerusalem, using wooden motifs that are centuries old. It is possible that the tattooing custom spread elsewhere in the Mediterranean. The Italian city of Taranto became another tattooing center for Christians, pilgrims, and sailors. It is possible that Mediterranean sailors outside of the city adopted tattoos on a wide scale to identify themselves as Christian. Either way, we have preserved several drawings of late 18th century tattoos from Taranto's sailors. These include the obvious religious symbols, including saints, the Virgin Mary, crosses, but also secular objects like galleys and, interestingly, a chain circumventing the wrist, possibly indicative of a former prisoner or slave oarsman. It is unknown for how long tattoos were widespread among Mediterranean sailors. This appears to be the oldest example. But there are older examples of pilgrim tattoos. This painting of Heinrich Wilhelm Ludolf shows him tattooed with Jesus on the cross. Note the skull and bones below it, the temple, and 1699, the year of his pilgrimage. One of the visually strangest tattoos is this one, showing the way of sorrows, the path which Jesus carried his cross to the place of execution. This one shows the tattoos of Rutger Stubbe, including the usual religious iconography, the Jerusalem cross, 1669, the year of his pilgrimage, and once more, the skull and bones below a crucified Christ. We do have detailed knowledge of how these tattoos were made. Firstly, ox gall, charcoal, and the smoke that rises from lamps was mixed in a leaden dish to produce the ink. The traveler would choose from over 60 different motifs carved into wooden models. The chosen motif was then sprinkled with charcoal dust and pressed against a patch of skin that was to be marked, usually the forearm, but sometimes the shoulder, chest, and in one case, even the buttocks. The artist then took the body part forcefully and pricked the image with a pair of very thin sewing needles. When finished, the area was cleaned with a wine-soaked sponge to see if anything was missing or needed correction. Afterwards, the skin was stretched open to expand the needle holes, after which the ink was applied. The wound was then bound with linen cloth for 8 days, after which the skin would peel away, leaving behind the image. Different recipients took the procedure in different ways. Some would barely react, and could smoke a pipe, have a cup of tea, and a nice chat with the artist's wife. Others found it so painful that they couldn't have more than one tattoo. Perhaps a test of faith. Indeed, multiple authors noted how the procedure could lead to illness, even death, most likely from infection. Another common ingredient for the ink was gunpowder. Black powder has excellent dyeing properties. If it somehow embeds itself into the skin, it will leave a permanent mark. For example, during a premature detonation of a cartridge, blasting grains of unburned powder into the skin, permanently marking it with small blue and black dots. Certainly, these were the marks of many a ship's gunner. Gunpowder was cheap and readily available, making it an excellent marking ingredient. Indeed, tattoos weren't only given to pilgrims, but were relatively widespread back home in Europe. Here they went by many different names, but gunpowder spot is one of the most appropriate. In spite of their very piratey sounding name, these gunpowder tattoos were more associated with fine ladies and a certain type of finely dressed effeminates, known as fops. For example, at the court of Queen Anne of Austria, the ladies-in-waiting spoke of their lovers having tattooed their names on their arms. It even appeared in love poems, like this one from 1704 by William Wycherley. Thy gunpowder on thy hand shot me dead, half dead with love before, killed me both on and by the spot, thy cruel white hand on it wore. If one was scared of the needle, there existed little black plasters with a motif that you could just paste on your arm. In short, there doesn't seem to have been a taboo against tattoos in the period, nor any association with any particular group of people, aside perhaps from pilgrims. So a pirate from Europe wasn't any more likely than anyone else to have a tattoo. The situation was slightly different in the American colonies. Tattooing had been practiced in the Americas long before the arrival of the Europeans, and the white travelers were often very fascinated by these markings, comparing them to their own tattooing culture and history, including the ancient practices of the Picts and the Jerusalem cross. Europeans were fascinated how the Americans used tattoos to communicate matters of spirituality or social class, essentially a sort of illiterate literacy. Pirates spent a lot of time among native groups, most prominently the Mosquito and Kuna. They would often recruit warriors from these peoples, usually employed as spearfishers for their excellent hunting skills. So if you'd want to see a heavily tattooed pirate, chances are that they'd be a Native American. We are fortunate to have some Buccaneer scholars who lived among these peoples and documented the way in which they lived and tattooed themselves. Lionel Wafer, a Buccaneer surgeon, lived among the Kuna while recovering from a leg injury. He describes how the Kuna had both temporary tattoos, just painted on the body and tempered with oil, both for war and leisure, and also permanent markings. These were made by first drawing the motif with a brush. These motifs included birds, beasts, men, trees, and the like. And it was then pricked with a sharp thorn until blood gushed out, after which the skin was rubbed with the ink. The color could be red, yellow, or blue. However, even though Lionel had painted his skin, he was never permanently tattooed, and said it was uncommon even among the Kuna. Only 1 in 40 would do it. He describes how one of his Buccaneer companions, a man named Bullman, had a Kuna tattoo on his cheek, which he desired to remove, only possible with scarification. This was the only European taboo against tattoos. Heathen tattoos were seen as, well, heathen, and removal was often desired. Anyway, this incident shows that pirates who spent time with native groups could get painted or even tattooed, if they so desired. But this wasn't anything unique to pirates. Any colonial Europeans who spent a short or significant amount of time among native groups might get tattooed, either to ingratiate themselves with the local community or as a sort of souvenir of their experience. It was common among fur traders, survivors, and explorers. And if they didn't want the heathen implications of their tattoos, they might request a Christian motif. From its 1699 travel journal, Monsieur D'Yarreville documented all types of images, crosses, the name of Jesus, flowers. In short, tattoos would not have been uncommon for Europeans in the New World. They would seemingly become even more widespread, or at least better documented, in the 18th century. Various documents makes it clear that gunpowder spots and other tattoos were relatively common among the lower classes, including indentured servants, laborers, and sailors. All of these groups were significant recruitment pools for pirates. Let's look at a few examples. In 1720, the American Mercury posted a notice of 2 escaped servants, one of whom was a sailor named Samuel Penbrook. On one hand, he had his initials tattooed, on the other blue spots, possibly from a gunpowder accident. On one of his arms, he had a savior on the cross, and the other Adam and Eve. All of it had been done with gunpowder. On the 9th of June, 1738, the Virginia Gazette reported the escape of multiple servants, including a carpenter named Richard Kibble. He had several gunpowder spots, most notable being the figure of a woman and a cherry tree on his breast. A couple of years later, the Gazette documented a convict servant, William Roberts, who had the name Mary Roberts tattooed on one of his arms, possibly his wife, and on his other arm he had a heart pierced by a dart, a common symbol on pirate flags. As aforementioned, women would also have gunpowder spots. The Gazette describes a female convict, Winifred Thomas, marked on the inside of her right arm, with gunpowder WT and the date of the year underneath. The initials were obviously made for identification purposes, possibly by her master. Easier identification would have made them easier to track down and capture. But many of the spots appear to have been voluntary, considering how many of the motifs were more personal and pleasant. Religious motifs were definitely the most common. So yeah, it is entirely possible that sailors and pirates during the Golden Age would have had gunpowder tattoos. And even if we don't have a documented case of this, it is entirely possible that they may even have had skull and bone tattoos, since this was seen on at least 2 pilgrim tattoos, even if it was in a spiritual context. Skull and bones often appeared on rings, a memento mori, or reminder of death. The skull was originally not a pirate symbol, it was just something they adopted since it was a symbol of death. Very spooky. However, gunpowder spots were nothing unique to pirates or the maritime scene at this point, and it is difficult to say with any confidence how popular they were within these cultures. As the 18th century progressed, tattoos became increasingly popular with sailors, especially in the United States, as they became an easy way in which to identify a sailor. An act passed in 1796 demanded that each sailor who served on a US vessel would have to provide a certificate of protection, including a detailed physical description encompassing tattoos. The act was supposed to protect American sailors from being forced into the British Royal Navy, one of the causes behind the War of 1812. Common American tattoos included maritime and religious symbols, such as anchors and crucifixes. More complex ones encompassed ships, mermaids, and sea creatures. Marks of love included hearts, names of lovers, doves, and then we have patriotic symbols like flags, eagles, clusters of stars, and words like independence, liberty, and 1776. 95% of these tattoos could be found on the sailors' arms and hands. One theory goes that Captain Cook popularized the tattoo, and that it had previously been more restrictive. Even though tattoos were used by the upper class, we can also see how they were available among the lower rungs of society. Either way, in the 19th century, the advent of scientific racism meant that skin markings, now dubbed tattoos, would come to be associated with Polynesians and other tribal peoples, savages. The West forgot about its own history of skin markings, and the practice became relegated to the outliers of society: criminals, prostitutes, and sailors. The tattoo became taboo, another Polynesian loanword. Captain Sparrow also has the letter P, meaning pirate, branded into his forearm by the East India Company. This might seem superfluous and unrealistic, why not just hang him, but this was actually a real practice by the company. In 1686, when the crew of the Royal James were tried for trying to escape and turn pirate, 3 of the ringleaders were executed by various methods, and 3 others were branded on the forehead and hand with the letter P, and sentenced to be deported in chains. The reason for this quote-unquote mercy was that the company could not inflict a death penalty except in very exceptional cases. All cases of piracy had to be sent to England for trial. The branded men were not pirates, they were attempted pirates. Criminals never seemed to have been branded on the forearm. This would have been easy to conceal, and the whole point was that their crimes should be visible. However, after 1683, the company were allowed to take pirates to trial, but only in Bombay and Madras. This meant that the practice of branding and deporting continued as a common punishment, even for actual pirates. Much like tattooing, branding has a very old history. It was already used in ancient Mesopotamia to not only mark animals as belonging to a certain farmer, but slaves. This practice was then picked up by the Romans, who used them on humans in a similar fashion to the tattoos, and this then continued into medieval Europe. Penal branding on the face could be prescribed, for example, to counterfeiters. That said, there was some religious opposition to it. Defacing the face made in God's image was said to be blasphemous, according to a prohibition by Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. In France, facial branding was replaced by shoulder brands as early as 1562. In England, branding had traditionally been reserved for vagrants and escaped labourers, but became increasingly common with the religious disputes of the 16th and 17th century. In 1618, a man named John Trask, who preached the virtues of the kosher diet, was condemned as a Judaizer and branded on the forehead with the letter J. James Naylor, a notable Quaker, was branded with the letter B for blasphemy. For lesser crimes or first-time offenders, one could claim benefit of clergy, meaning that they would only be branded on the hand or even just the thumb, where it wouldn't be visible until close inspection, and thus not be of any immediate social consequence. Branded individuals would have a harder time finding jobs and might even be harassed. The criminal was branded in the courtroom, their hands shackled to prevent their escape or unnecessary damage. How merciful. The Puritans had a special fascination with branding, and would take it with them to their providential paradise in the New World. And criminals could get branded for thievery, blaspheming, or even fornication. Across the colonies, indentured servants who dared to escape would be branded with the letters FT, fugitive traitor. A lot of pirates were former criminals and would have carried brands as a result. One of them was a buccaneer named Juan Gallardo. Of native origin, Gallardo hailed from the islands of Lake Nicaragua, where he worked as a pilot for trading vessels on the river. Having committed a murder, he was made a slave and branded on the forehead. When a company of buccaneers attacked Granada, he and a number of Native Americans were more than glad to join them, presumably as guides. Gallardo would continue his buccaneering career until 1670, having served under captains like Henry Morgan, Lawrence Prince, and Francois L'Olonnais. However, brands were most commonly found on the bodies of enslaved Africans. Between 1500 and 1800, approximately 4 million Africans ferried across the Atlantic were branded the moment they were taken aboard a slave ship, and then in the colonies once they had been sold to a master. Said master would brand them with their own marks or initials, usually on the breast or shoulder. However, each time the slave was sold to a new master, he or she was branded again. One 17th century priest observed a man who had been sold and resold several times and was in the end as covered with characters as an Egyptian obelisk. Much like former criminals, former slaves could find themselves aboard pirate ships as free crewmen. However, the status of Africans aboard pirate ships is often ambiguous, and most often the bulk of them are noted as slaves, forced to do heavy labor for the pirates before being sold. Whether free or unfree, almost any African found aboard a pirate ship was bound to carry this cruel mark. A lot of you watching engage in various forms of creative endeavors, ranging from novel writing to game design. Some of you have expressed interest or contacted me for consultation in your projects. So with the advice from one of my clients, I have set up a Fiverr account where you can now hire me to consult on your project. I offer research, proofreading, editing, and critique. Or we can just spitball ideas. You'll find a link in the video description or pinned comment below. Otherwise, support Gold Gunpowder by liking the video, giving your thoughts on the video, subscribing and clicking the notification bell. Monetarily by buying some merch or becoming a Patreon supporter, where $1 a month gets you early, ad-free and sponsor-free access to my videos.